Hello, what a gorgeous, gorgeous evening to be welcoming you all to the stunning surroundings of St Bride's for this year's annual Tom Olsen Lecture. Now, Tom was a vastly experienced journalist, but in the last years of his career, he was also wine correspondent at the Sunday Telegraph, and I just wonder what he would have thought about the work that's been done in the past couple of years by a group of scientists in America who've used artificial intelligence to come up with a virtual palate that tastes wine itself and has an accuracy rate of a whopping 95%. Now, that's efficient, sure, but as Tom, I'm sure, would have been the first person to point out, not nearly as much fun as doing it yourself. Now, I'm a journalist too. I work at ITV News. I'm a correspondent covering events here in the UK and across the globe. But over the past couple of months, I've spent time making a documentary for ITV Tonight about artificial intelligence. Now, its original title was AI, Should We Kill It Before It Kills Us? After a little bit of brainstorming, we thought we'd go for something rather less frightening, but possibly a little bit more prosaic, which was simply AI, What We Need to Know. And the one question that I was asked again and again during the making of that documentary was, well, artificial intelligence, is it going to take our jobs? Is it going to take our children's jobs? And so in order to test that, we decided we would make a digital replica of me, an AI reporter, if you like. So I spent, I don't know, an hour or so reading aloud in the studio, Brave New World, what else? Posed for a couple of photographs, and then one of our brilliantly talented young producers spent around half an hour on widely available technology and made this digital replica of me. And so for me, the moment I understood, I think, or started to, the pitfalls and the potential of AI was when I saw myself, or a type of myself on screen, speaking words I'd never spoken and answering questions I'd never even thought to ask. Worse still, my boss walked past my laptop, took one look at the screen and said, "Oh, lovely piece to camera, Rachel," which was the moment when I wondered whether I'd managed to do myself out of a job. Now, when we looked at that deep fake, and it was the most basic one, of course it wouldn't have fooled my boss or anyone else for much longer, and dug into the speed at which the technology is moving, it got us thinking about what the same technology could do in the wrong hands. And even in the past 24 hours, we've seen, haven't we, the man who is alleged to have gone into the grounds of Windsor Castle with a crossbow, telling a court it was his AI girlfriend that encouraged him to do it, a computer-generated chatbot. And I'm sure you will all have seen the deepfakes of Zelensky, Trump, Biden. And as journalists, that makes things increasingly difficult for us, because who are we if not the people who are there to tell you the difference between fact and fiction? And what's becoming clear is that's getting increasingly harder. Well, tonight we are lucky enough to be hearing from a man who has spent the 2.5 decades of his career making it a bit of a personal mission to make sure that uncovering truth remains right at the heart of what we do. He was behind the campaign to save the Freedom of Information Act, which, as any investigative journalist will tell you, is an incredible tool and really valuable when it comes to uncovering what is really going on and when the powers that be don't want to tell you. He is, of course, Dominic Ponsford. He is the editor-in-chief of the Press Gazette and media editor of the new Statesman Media Group. He's, throughout his career, managed to stay one step ahead in a rapidly changing media world, taking Press Gazette digital and doing it in some style. Last year, he was nominated for Editor of the Year at the PPA Awards. Now, I'm happy to tell you that Dominic, once he's finished his lecture, will be taking questions from you, so feel free to be thinking of those. And although I can't promise you that the drinks at the back will have been officially assessed and approved by any AI app, I do want to thank our sponsors tonight, Kaizo, for their ongoing generosity and support of this annual lecture series. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dominic Ponsford, who is calling on all of us in the journalism world not to be just mere scribes, but superheroes, as he explains how good journalism can save the world in the age of generative AI. Let's give a really warm welcome to Dom.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I like that question. Should we kill generative AI before it kills us? So if anyone's got a train to catch or needs to get home, the short version of my lecture is yes. No, there's a bit more nuance than that, as you'd expect. So good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this year's Tom Olsen Lecture on this hallowed ground of St Bride's Church. For the more secular and lapsed among us, this place tends to be associated with extremes of emotion. Celebrations like the wonderful journalist charity carol service, which ushers in the end of another year. Memorials to much-loved colleagues, which I've been to a few of, or a place to go for contemplation in moments of quiet despair, which there's been a few of in my career, I'm not ashamed to tell you. Tonight for me is a celebration of surviving 20 years in that most precarious of roles, a journalist's journalist. And dare I say it, of the fact that the title I've steered, and at times just clung to for dear life, Press Gazette has not just survived, but thrived, rather against the odds. And it's also a chance to contemplate probably the biggest challenge our industry has faced in that 20 years, the rise of generative AI. I'm going to suggest some ways in which the news media might weather the AI storm and even harness it to sail forwards. But first, I'd like to look at some of the mistakes of the past in the hope that we learn from them and deal with this next phase of technological revolution better than previous ones. I remain hugely optimistic about the future of journalism, about the current vibrancy of our trade, and of its capacity to bring about positive change, while it must be said, breaking a few things along the way. But it would be remiss of me not to use this podium to ring an alarm bell over the fact that in the space of a generation, we've allowed something wonderful, positive, and immeasurably valuable for society to be savagely diminished. And by that, I mean local journalism. Many will recall that Press Gazette came very close to being a casualty itself of the 2008 financial crisis and the first major wave of digital disruption to hit the print publishing industry. In April 2009, I was fired and announced the closure of Press Gazette for a second time in the space of 3 years. At the time, I wrote a not entirely disinterested comment piece for The Guardian, warning that if Press Gazette were to die, it could be seen as a canary in the coal mine for the news industry. After a year or so in which it felt like I'd been writing of little else other than closures and job cuts, I'd written the story of my title's own demise. This was a tragedy, I said at the time, for the stories that would no longer be told. Well, thankfully, on a beach somewhere, reading his Guardian media section, entrepreneur Mike Danson saw my coded plea and decided to throw Press Gazette a lifeline at a point in our journey when we felt like Kate Winslet in the closing scenes of Titanic. And could so easily have ended up like Leonardo DiCaprio, sinking lifeless to the bottom of the ocean, like so many other news brands in that period. Since then, we've continued under the same ownership, and it's guaranteed our independence, while also providing extra support when we've needed it, which has put us in quite a privileged position and enabled us to carry on our campaigning work. If Press Gazette is a bellwether for the industry we cover, our experience since 2009 should give everyone huge grounds for optimism. Last year was our most profitable since the early 2000s, and we now have a 10-strong team producing our website, podcast, newsletters and awards and other events. So I deliver this lecture as someone who's not only reported on the trials, tribulations and triumphs of the UK news business over the last 20 years, but as someone who's lived it at the sharp end and has the grey hairs to prove it, more grey hairs than dark ones, really. So my journalism career began in 1998 as a district reporter at the Battle Observer in East Sussex. This was a time when a revolution in printing technology had made local newspaper publishing vastly profitable, though very little of those profits were, it seemed, being reinvested in the product. In many ways, it was a dream job, driving around the Sussex countryside in a battered Morris Minor as the district reporter for a historic town and its surrounding villages. I was in charge of my own edition, trying to get a front-page story out of a constituency of less than 10,000 people every week, as well as filling 6 or 7 change pages. As my first editor assured me, if nothing happens, that's a story. I'm still not sure what he meant by that, because I don't think... But, you know, something always happened, luckily. So my only gripes were the comparative lack of hard news in my rural patch, no murder and mayhem, certainly not compared with nearby Hastings, and the money, which at £8,000 per year meant I needed to take an additional part-time work, even to support my pathetically cheap lifestyle in a shared house in Hastings. Then, as now, local newspaper journalists were a class apart from the rest of society, an underclass. It didn't feel like it, but at the time, this was around the high water mark. Sort of late 90s, early 2000s was the high watermark of local newspaper profitability, with owner Johnston Press delivering 40% profit margins to its grateful shareholders. Back then, my title, the 2-edition Rye and Battle Observer, seems to be run in the cheapest way possible: a reporter per edition and a shared sub-editor, so 3 poorly paid staff. I was amazed at the time that the awesome responsibility of being the eyes and ears of a local community could rest with me, a brand new journalism graduate who did not know his widows from his orphans. My drive to carry on in this career, despite relative penury, came from the gradual realisation that every day I had the potential to change the world for the better. It's something that's stuck with me ever since. I was a sort of keyboard-wielding superhero who could change the world with words printed on thousands of newspapers, read by an entire community every week. At university, I dreamt of being a foreign correspondent like James Cameron, or an investigative journalist like Philip Knightley, or a gonzo reporter like Hunter S. Thompson. But in the town council meetings, police and fire stations, and district council agendas of battle, I found a calling that in its way was just as glamorous: mining for news at the coalface of journalism. Being the bloke who enabled the whole news business and the whole of society to function smoothly by providing the precious building blocks of independently verified and sourced information. We led the fight against a huge waste incinerator being cited in battle. We campaigned in favour of the pedestrianisation of the high street. Or maybe we campaigned against the pedestrianisation of the high street. I can't remember. One way or the other way, it was very important. And when a young political upstart called Nigel Farage launched his political career, trying to steal the safe Tory seat for UKIP, we followed his campaign with interest. I was there to console the bereaved and ensure their loved ones were remembered, in some cases to highlight the negligence which had led to their deaths. Head teachers, business owners and police inspectors may have been paid vastly more than I, but they all beat a path to my door when they needed to get a message out to the local community, and they answered the phone when I put questions to them on behalf of that community. Even at a shoestring operation like the Johnston Press-owned Observer series, there was a strong sense of reporters being the eyes and ears of their communities. Court cases were covered, council meetings attended. Much of the job simply involved walking the streets, meeting people, looking at notice boards, and trying to work out what was happening. Back then, there were around 20 journalists covering the towns of Rye, Battle, Hastings, Bexhill, with centuries of experience and knowledge between them. Today, the operation down there continues, but it comprises just 3 or 4 journalists, depending on whether you count a share of the BBC-funded Local Democracy Reporter. It's the same story across the UK, where most local newspaper titles survive, but only as hollowed-out shells compared with what they were. Journalists tend to write for online, with newspapers compiled in retrospect. The focus is on stories which drive clicks, so restaurant openings, mansions for sale with lots of pictures, cute puppies in need of a home. These all tend to do well. Stories about local politics, less so. Face-to-face shoe leather reporting has largely gone out of the window. It's the same story now across the UK. Some London boroughs have no professional journalists at all holding them to account. Kensington and Chelsea is a case in point. 1990, it had 2 dedicated newspapers with more than a dozen journalists covering the patch. By 2016, there were no dedicated local newspaper journalists in the borough at all, and no one to pick up on concerns raised by Grenfell Tower residents about the fire safety in their block of flats in a blog post. As we all know, in 2017, 79 residents died when the block where those concerns were raised burned to the ground. Grant Feller, who worked for the Kensington News in 1990, told me, any local newspaper journalist worth his or her salt would have been all over the story because of that blog. Technology has meant that a smaller number of local journalists cover a lot of ground. Those that remain do an amazing job. And there are some impressive local news titles remaining. But the fact remains there has been a colossal decline in professional independent local journalists, from more than 13,000 journalists to possibly just a few thousand remaining. This is a tragedy for people in many communities who no longer have a voice. For modern democracy, we're in uncharted territory. The universal franchise depends on an informed electorate, but there's now a whole tranche of local democracy largely uncovered, except by Facebook groups. We only have to look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal to get an idea how that might work out for us. This tragedy was probably hastened by the greed of newspaper owners and a cynical strategy which always seemed focused on making money on the way down. But the biggest driver of decline was the arrival on the scene of tech platforms, which offered a far more cost-effective way to target customers for small and medium-sized business advertisers. Pre-2008, the largest columns on local newspaper balance sheets were advertising for jobs, cars, and homes. After that date, advertising all but disappeared to specialist sites and to Google and Facebook. In 2007, press advertising, so that's magazines and all magazines and all newspapers in the UK combined, was worth £7 billion a year. That's about £11 billion in today's money. In 2022, last year, all national, regional and magazine titles combined made around £2 billion in advertising in print and online. That's out of a £35 billion total UK ad spend. By comparison, last year, around £15 billion of UK ad spend was spent with 2 US tech companies alone, Alphabet and Meta, or Google and Facebook in old money. So it's worth pausing for a moment to consider that disparity. So those 2 companies, who don't employ any journalists, make something like 7 times the amount in advertising revenue of every UK newspaper and magazine title in print and online combined. It's not as if those news publishers don't have an audience or have been slouches when it comes to digital transformation. Our biggest national and regional publisher, Reach, has a monthly audience of 38 million in the UK. News UK has 30 million, and the Daily Mail Group also 30 million online. But the digital ecosystem is a casino rigged in favour of the house, Alphabet and Meta, who are the effective owners of the internet in the UK. So this will sound partly like whining about competitors who are just better at serving their customers, but the duopoly's dominance was brought about because of a couple of colossal mistakes. Mistake number 1. These tech platforms were allowed to bear almost no legal responsibility for what they publish. So they provide content at a small fraction of the cost of professional publishers, who are governed by defamation, privacy, contempt laws, as well as the Advertising Standards Association. This is because at the start of the internet, service providers were made no more responsible for the content they published than newspaper delivery companies are. Legislators couldn't have predicted the rise of social media and the extent to which platforms like Google would become publishers in their own right. Google, Facebook, and others were able to scale quickly because their content is provided for free. And it matters not a jot to them whether it's true or even legal. To quote Stanley Baldwin, talking about the old print barons in the 1930s, they have power without responsibility. Mistake number 2. Regulators allow monopolies to grow unchecked. Google has a monopoly position over search, a monopolistic control over the advertising technology which underpins the web. Meta has a near monopoly over social media via Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. They've been allowed to commercially milk a level of dominance which would not be allowed in any other aspect of the economy. The nightmare of what to do about the impact of unfettered foreign-owned tech monopolies eating the lion's share of UK ad spend remains unresolved, but will hopefully be finally addressed this year in the Digital Markets Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. It looks set to force them to share data and some revenue with news publishers. Alphabet, Meta, and increasingly Apple and Amazon have taken the ad revenue which previously paid for the journalism which underpinned our democracy and bound local communities together. They're fighting tooth and nail against any attempts to persuade them to give back a little of that vast wealth to help rebuild industries which they've helped to destroy. In Canada, they're threatening to block journalism on their networks rather than be forced to pay publishers for content. Such tactics will be coming to the UK soon. In my view, debate around the value of clicks driven back and forth between Google and Facebook and publishers is a red herring, as are questions around the value of professionally produced content on platforms. Though clearly, Google and Facebook would be very less interesting places for their users to spend time without journalism. The simple fact is that Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, Apple, TikTok, Netflix, and others have reached a size where they have so much power, influence, and audience that they should be compelled to give a little back to the societies which they drain cash from. Commercial broadcast TV news survives not because it is profitable, but because Ofcom and the government dictates that it is the cost of doing business for ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5. I'd argue that everyone has a right to access quality local journalism about the place where they live. And it's entirely right and justified that the tech giants should share a little of their turnover, say 10%, to fund it. It's exactly the same as mining companies or oil producers are expected to pay extra tax for the privilege of extracting our country's natural resources. Now, the devil will come in the detail of how this local public interest journalism gets funded. But I'd argue that ultimately we should focus on supporting journalists with a public service remit whose work is available for use by all as a public resource. So they'd write for local newspapers, websites, TV, and even the tech platforms. We should create an independent network of public service news agencies funded by the tech media giants. Publishers who meet the public service threshold should also be allowed to apply for support from the Tech Media Giants Fund. In my 20 years at Press Gazette, I've seen again and again the power and value of independent journalism in my professional community. It's something which every community deserves to have. Perhaps the most vivid example was 2007, when I was contacted by a distraught local newspaper journalist called Sally Mura, who was on police bail after being arrested by counter-terrorism officers, strip-searched and threatened with life imprisonment under interrogation, under the then obscure offence of aiding and abetting misconduct in a public office. Her home was ransacked by police, her children terrorised, and her notepads, phone and computer equipment seized. Her only offence, it seemed, had been to have off-the-record conversations with a police contact. She said Press Gazette's coverage of her case was a turning point for her. It rallied support amongst the industry, and the charges against her were eventually thrown out, although Thames Valley Police predictably admitted doing no wrong. This obscure common law offence was one we got to know well, and the heavy-handed police tactics, as the Met Police charged some 28 former Sun and News of the World journalists with misconduct in a public office under Operation Elvedon from 2011 to 2014. The intimidatory use of arrest and criminal trial against journalists paying for public interest stories was unheard of in the UK. I'm proud that Press Gazette was the first, and for some time the only, publication to raise concerns about this. Eventually, all were cleared. In 2014, it was Press Gazette which raised the alarm when we discovered the Met Police had accessed the phone records of journalists at The Sun in order to find and punish lawful sources. At that time, in the wake of the hacking scandal, few were interested in a story which painted tabloid journalists as victims. Press Gazette's Save Our Sources campaign would reveal that surveillance of journalists and their sources was widespread amongst police forces across the UK, who were abusing their powers to protect their own reputations. We were eventually successful in helping to secure a change to the law, banning police from accessing journalist call records without court approval. Today, Press Gazette's campaigning focus is around securing a fair shout for news publishers in a media ecosystem where they've gone from being apex predators to on the endangered list. We've also sought to shine a light on the secret multi-million-pound deals Google has done with nearly every publisher in the world in order to win friends and protect its monopoly. Generative AI is today the hottest topic on our news agenda. It seems unbelievable that ChatGPT has only been with us for just over 6 months. It already has more than 100 million users. And along with its competitors, it looks set to become as ubiquitous as Google and as disruptive to the news business. As many of you will know, generative AI works by analysing billions of words which have been published online, including professional journalism, to answer questions, solve problems, and complete mini-projects via a sort of high-tech mimicry. For news publishers, ChatGPT and its imitators are being used widely as productivity tools, though with some caution, to create summaries of articles and facilitate chat-style functions based on in-house material. AI could herald in a wave of automation for publishers every bit as liberating as the move away from hot metal to computer-led printing and typesetting was in the 1980s, freeing journalists and editors from rote tasks to let them focus on news gathering. Given ChatGPT's known propensity to hallucinate, and the fact it's merely predicting the answers users want to hear, it would be foolhardy in the extreme to let this technology loose in the wild to create news articles. Now, as we learned this week, some unscrupulous news publishers already appear to be using generative AI to set up fake sites in order to harvest cheap advertising clicks. The Bournemouth Observer is an entirely credible-looking website, but its staff appear to be fictional. Their bylines, pictures, are of models, and much of its content appears to be written by AI. The rise of such click farm websites makes it all the more important that sites based on professional journalism raise their game to keep clear blue water between them and the fakes. And they need to be extremely careful and open about using AI in content production. The real danger for publishers from ChatGPT is the fact that it answers questions for users without any recourse to the sources. It's already stolen all our copyrighted news material, and it's using it as fuel for an information engine which threatens to make us all redundant. ChatGPT, as it stands, is a business built upon theft. It's not only stolen our hard-earned information in order to power its model, it then steals our clicks and ad revenue, providing the readers with the information they seek without any reference back to the source. It needs to stop. I'd say urgent action is needed by regulators to look at this, and those publishers currently engaged in negotiations with ChatGPT creator OpenAI need to ensure they act with the long-term interests of all journalists and resist the temptation to cut short-term deals. Should we negotiate or just litigate to stop ChatGPT's blatant breach of copyright? That's the question. The current media scene is in some ways more vibrant now than it was 20 years ago when I started at Press Gazette. Telegraph, Times, Guardian, FT and Independent, all heavily loss-making back then, are now consistently profitable. Despite the dire predictions made by some media analysts around the time of the 2008 crash, few major legacy journalism brands have gone, and many new major brands have launched, like Politico, Industry Dive and Insider, to name just a few. If journalism is to survive and thrive in the next phase of the digital age, it will need protection from monopolistic tech giants and lawless insurgent platforms like ChatGPT. But to secure such protection, the news business has to prove that it's about more than just clicks and scrolls. It has to earn its special place in society. Surveys consistently show that UK journalists are among the least trusted in the world. I spoke at a University of the Third Age event earlier this year before around 200 70-plus-year-olds. Here, I thought, I would find a print news demographic. But when I asked them if they trusted journalists or trusted what they read, they literally laughed in my face. I said that when I spoke to young journalists, I always tell them to obey the golden rule, central to all religious ethics systems. Treat others as you would expect to be treated yourself. Don't think many journalists would last long doing that, snorted one irate septuagenarian. There are around 50,000 journalists in the UK, according to the latest census data, and many of us are clearly failing to do our good deed for the day. Otherwise, the esteem our profession is held in would be far higher. Most journalists like me start their careers wanting to be Clark Kent, or maybe the sainted Harold Evans. But some lose their way, and some, like the phone hackers at the News of the World and Mirror titles, can even turn out to be more akin to Lex Luthor. If UK publishers are to prove themselves worthy of the special protection, which I believe they need in the digital age, then many, I'm afraid, need to make some changes. Here's my shopping list. Number one, raise press standards, which is quite a broad one, I know. But these need to be followed in the spirit rather than to the letter. A well-known UK news website was plastered this week with the most intrusive photographs of a grieving family, solely because they were related to a Hollywood A-lister, Robert De Niro. Such pictures would not be allowed in UK privacy law or under the Editor's Code, which governs ipso. But they appeared online because they were taken in New York. A browse through the comments underneath the story showed how little readers thought of this. Yet this sort of casual cruelty still persists in some parts of British journalism. The post-hacking scandal reforms, which set up ipso, went a long way. And tabloids, in particular, are immeasurably better behaved now than when I first started reporting on them in the early 2000s. But ipso is essentially an improved complaints handling service. Its branding on a member website should be a sign that journalists there uphold the highest ethical and moral standards. We should start with following that golden rule. Something Jeremy Clarkson clearly failed to do with his column attacking Meghan Markle in the most vivid and personal terms. We need to stop the circular firing squad and industrialised ripping of stories from rivals. It's a sad reality of the Google age that rewrites of scoops often get more clicks than the scoops themselves. That's because Google won't set up a top stories box in its search results until after a story is broken. And it places a premium on recency over originality. So while follow-ups are part and parcel of journalism, some sites steal stories from their rivals on an industrial scale. Indeed, it can be far more cost-effective to write quick follow-ups than it is to create original journalism. This is annoying for readers, effectively penalises original work, and it's hardly the actions of an industry which deserves special treatment. It's really not much better than getting your articles written by ChatGPT. We need to stop the curse of cynical SEO writing based on gaming an algorithm and conning readers. Journalism should be about answering questions. But when the question is, what time is the football on? Is it really good use of a reporter's time to get them to spend 500 words writing a story which buries the answer near the bottom of the piece? There's always a place for froth and fun in journalism, but not at the expense of verification and adding value. 300-word write-ups of unchecked incidents on TikTok, which could themselves be deepfakes generated by AI for all we know, does not constitute reporting. Yet if you dig around in the hinterland of many of our most popular news websites, this is often what passes for news. Opinion and campaigns are among the great strengths of British newspapers, but opinionated news is one of the biggest reasons why readers say they don't trust journalism. Readers can smell bias a mile off and they hate it. So I'd say, keep the opinion pages gutsy, the campaigns brave, but clearly label them and keep the news straight. Good journalism can and does save the world every day, one story at a time. Marie Colvin, who I remember seeing speak here many years ago, of the Sunday Times, famously saved hundreds of lives when she refused to leave a perceived refugee camp in East Timor in 1999. Amelia Gentleman of The Guardian saved hundreds of Caribbean immigrants to the UK from possible deportation thanks to her exposure of the Windrush scandal. Failings at the Mid Staffordshire NHS Trust, exposed by the Wolverhampton Express and Star in the late 2000s, led to a public inquiry and changes that will save hundreds of lives by halting widespread medical negligence. UK politicians are less corrupt because they know that every time they meet a possible business contact in a hotel room, there could be a hidden camera behind the plant pot, and it could be a sting for the Sunday Times. Last year, Pippa Creer at the Mirror saved us all from being governed by a bounder and a cad when she revealed the hypocrisy and dishonesty around Downing Street's adherence to coronavirus rules. If we don't take action to ensure generative AI and big tech is properly regulated and content creators fairly paid, this sort of journalism will be put at risk. If we get it right, we might just give communities across the UK back their voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dom.
I mean, that's a challenge to everybody working in journalism, to be more than clicks and scrolls to earn our special place in society. But as you say, the challenges are aplenty. So I would like to open the session up to questions from you in the audience. There will be 2 roving mics. Please do put up your hand so we can get a microphone to you. It would help us enormously if you introduce yourself, and when you ask the question, if you can speak clearly into the microphone, make it as simple as possible, and if you can, stick to one question at a time. That will help us enormously. Let's begin. Yes, if I could ask gentlemen in second.
I'm not sure if I've left anything unsaid, to be honest, but you know, we'll see.
Just over here, please, in the check shirt. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that on? Okay. My question is this. My name is Peter Crumpler. I'm a reverend in the Church of England. I'm very aware that where we're standing here is a meeting place between journalism and the church. One of the things I'm very keen on is getting churches to engage with their local media, because churches are grassroots organisations. Is that on?
I'll hold it.
Okay, so my question is there a particular role, do you feel, for the church and for faith groups, for the church and the faith groups to be supporting good grassroots journalism around the country? And what can we do?
Yeah, well, very much so, yeah. Heck of a story 2,000 years ago. First there was the word. I think, I mean, I think local newspapers are all about community, aren't they? So I think they have a very similar challenge, don't they? Probably to the Church of England, which is a sort of ageing demographic, and the sort of challenge of sort of re-engaging with a sort of younger audience who are very distracted and difficult to pin down. So I think, I think Vickers would probably find a fairly receptive audience there with local editors and local journalists. But I guess probably the trick comes is that really you have to be a bit of a reporter yourself now in order to get stuff into local papers, because they don't necessarily have the staff to write everything up. So I think if you can provide content for them which is fairly well written and provide photographs of events and provide things in a fairly oven-ready sort of format, then I think it'll be particularly receptive. I think if you've got anything to do with sort of rehoming puppies or anything like that, that goes down very well as well, I think. Yeah.
No, it does work.
I'm Rob McGibbon, a freelance. Dom, you mentioned the word litigate, an option for the newspaper industry against ChatGPT. Do you think they should litigate and pull their resources and take them on? And the other question is on something else. Substack and the Manchester Mill and hyperlocal news and subscribers is an emerging option. Do you think that's viable and will grow? Is that an option for journalism? But the main thing is, do we litigate?
Yeah, I have to say, since I wrote my speech, I've actually hardened my view on it a bit. I think they should. I think it's. We're going to look back on it and think it's absolutely mad that we let ChatGPT just out into the wild, having read everything that's ever been published, and we just said, off you go. And I think, to be honest, I think OpenAI are trying it on a bit in the way that, same way that other tech companies have done sort of throughout the sort of recent period. So Napster just stole everyone's music, didn't it? And just offered it for free streaming and claimed there was a sort of copyright exemption. And then it turned out there was a massive, as I recall, massive multi-billion-pound legal action, and Napster got closed down, and that was the end of Napster. So, I think there's a good chance that they probably should just say stop, because I don't see how you could really come up with a licensing regime that was in any way fair or transparent when the whole thing goes on inside a secret black box. And apart from anything else, the answers ChatGPT gives are completely unreliable, aren't they? So, because it hallucinates, it makes things up, tells things you want to hear. So it's sort of just, may look back on it and just think it's colossally irresponsible. But I think that said, I think the tech is incredibly clever and useful, and I think used in a controlled way, it could be brilliant. So all the news publishers could get together and say, we're going to have our own version of ChatGPT, which is verified, based on our news coverage, which is sourced back, and which maybe you could pay to use. You think, well, that sounds like, maybe a more sensible way to use the technology. I think Substack for local news is interesting, but I know there's the Manchester Mill, which has a paid-for edition, like a couple of thousand copies. But I think, as far as I can tell, it's only going to work in like really big cities like that, and it's only going to work for a tiny, information-rich elite, if you like, a tiny amount of people. It's not going to be a way of informing everyone in the wonderful way that advertising had been for sort of 200 years, really, hasn't it, up until now?
Graham Dudman, teach journalist students at News Associates, and I was one of those journalists at The Sun who you referenced, Dominic, who had a visit from 10 police officers at 7 o'clock in the morning and spent 3.5 years on bail under Operation Elvid. And thank you very much for your support. It meant the world and it made all the difference, and I'll never forget it. Thank you very much. Yeah, my question is, how long do you think print newspapers will survive?
I think print will be around forever, to be honest. I think it's, but you know, it is going to become increasingly sort of niche. But if you look at something like Private Eye, which is completely immune to, you know, any sort of a decline, because it's got stuff that you can't get anywhere else. It's good value. It's, you know, it's a pleasure to pick it up and read it. And probably people see it as a bit of a break from the screen. So I do think print will always have a place, but it is vanishingly small. If you look at the circulation of the Sun now, I imagine it's about 700,000. And what was it when you were, how much? 3.2 million. But then again, 700,000 people going into a newsagent every day, handing over whatever it is, ATP or whatever, is not to be sniffed at. But it is going down at about 18% a year, isn't it? So it's probably got, I'm no mathematician, but it's got it's actually got a surprisingly long tail to it, even going down at that high rate. But, you know, it is going to get pretty small, I think.
We have a question just down here. In the front, also very keen to hear from some women too.
Hello, Ed Robertson, as you know. I was on the Kensington Chelsea News actually when they closed our offices in London, Smith, to move us to a central hub in Hounslow where everything would be better. Next week in my webinar, I'm actually interviewing someone from Reach at the central newsroom where there are 170 journalists churning out news across the country. The argument's already been made that it's cheaper and more effective, and that seems to be the only argument people listen to anymore. So how do you start turning it around and showing that a value beyond money is worth something in itself?
I hate to say it, and I probably shouldn't say it because they are my constituents, but I'd probably stop listening to the newspaper owners who are obviously, you know, are at the end of the day shareholders who are defending a particular business model. But they probably have quite a strong, you know, voice. And maybe listen a bit more to people who are just talking about perhaps a non-profit solution or because I think there are certain parts of the country now, probably amazing, isn't it, Kensington and Chelsea, to think, but it's not profitable, is it, to do quality local news there. So, fine, let's come up with a good non-profit solution. And that's not a radical thing to say, is it, in the UK? If you think that the BBC employs more journalists, probably, or certainly, than every national and regional newspaper combined, and it's entirely state-funded. So it's not like heresy, is it, to suggest that probably some sort of high-quality, you know, state-backed solution is needed, where there's like total market failure. But you know, the kind of benefits of it are pretty clear. I think we need a lady, don't we? Oh, yeah. Oh, you've had the offer.
Yeah. Over at the back on the right, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, hello. Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm a reporter at IR Magazine, and I'm also a part-time trainee at News Associates. Hi, Graham. My question was basically, a company got in touch with me on LinkedIn, and they asked me to interview for this financial position. They're a very specialized company. And they basically said that they're trialing out using ChatGPT to write stories for them. So they put in a press release into ChatGPT, and then they basically just upload that onto their website, and that's kind of where they generate their source from. They basically asked how comfortable I would be with doing this as part of my day-to-day role, and said that the reason behind doing this was so it frees up time in the morning, so you get your news out in the day, and then you spend the rest of your time on features and other important things. Do you see this becoming a reality now? And also, do you get the logic behind it?
My first instinct is to run a mile, I think. But I mean, that said, maybe if it's the press release goes through the ChatGPT scrambulator, you're checking it. You know, maybe it's a time saver. Maybe it's doing some things. Maybe it's adding links. You know, coming up with a possible headline. Maybe it's, you know, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily write it off, but it does. I think it does sound like a pretty sort of low-grade way to fill a website. Yeah, it feels like a little bit of an abdication of journalistic responsibility, doesn't it? There might be a good story in that press release, or it might be complete cobblers, mightn't it, for all we know? But I guess that's why you went to News Associates, isn't it, to get the skills from Graham to be able to tell one from the other. It just feels like a little bit of a waste of that hard-earned training.
Hi, my name's Ed Boucher, I'm a freelancer. On ChatGPT, obviously I've played with it and I've had lots of inaccuracies coming up. Perhaps my naivety had thought that it would become more accurate over time as more and more people used it and more information sort of got sucked in. But you were implying that's not true. It'll not, did I understand you correctly? It won't get any more accurate because it just wants to feed people what they want to hear, so the accuracy won't improve. Is that right? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's just been a lot of reports where we've spoken to people where it gets things wrong because of the way it's set up. I think we had an interview with someone at the Guardian today, and they said they even got it to say, you know, a very specific task, you know, based on a specific set of stories within the CMS, and it still fabricated quotes. So, you know, it was. So it's, yeah, as far as I can tell, it's sort of inherently a bit unstable. That's not to say it won't get better, though, and maybe it will get better. But I think at the moment, as far as I can tell, it just seems to be an inherently iffy.
Just like you. 6 months ago, it was giving me the wrong year for when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I assumed it would get better at stuff like that, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, actually, interestingly, when we were filming this documentary, there was an incident reported to us by somebody who had spent a lot of time studying these kind of language learning models, generative models, who found its creators rather surprised that it had been taught to respond in English and at some point began to respond in Persian. So can they learn? I think what we're going to see over the next few years, and possibly even less given how quickly this technology is moving, is increased capacity to do so. Any more questions? Lovely, one here please, on the right.
Matt Capon, City University and recovering Reach employee. There's more to use of AI in newsrooms, of course, because you've also got things like Midjourney, which is actually having the same effect on the visual side of journalism as much as it is with the written side of journalism. And what I've seen is that with the publication of the digital news reports, that it gave a little bit of a seismic fear across the industry. But is the industry actually going to pay attention? Because when you look at the data, the signs have been there that AI was going to reach this point where it was going to be much more prolifically used, but it seems like there's been a very convenient amount of, shall we say, industrial ignorance that what is the lesser of two evils, quality or quantity, where you can guarantee volume and as such guarantee clicks?
Well, I think as far as I can tell, the industry's pretty woken up to it now. But are you saying you think that there might be a temptation for publishers to see this as a cheap way to fill space, rather? So.
You can see evidence of it across certain social platforms as well, where Midjourney particularly is being used in lieu of using actual photographers who then would otherwise use the pricing.
Well, I I think there probably is going to be, and there actually already is quite a bit of, automation in local news where you take data sets and sort of do stories about, say, based on NHS data or crime data or restaurant sort of health inspections, where you can actually create some quite useful content and do it automatically, and that's probably a good thing. I think you're probably right though. I think that probably some publishers are a bit kind of are probably thinking, well, maybe this is a cheap way to just do stuff and cut corners. But I think the difference now is those publishers at the quality end are actually quite powerful, aren't they? The ones that have got paywalls, and they're the ones that are really, really angry about it, because it's basically breached. It's not only breached their copyright, but it's breached all their paywall content, read it all, and is exploiting it for free, and they're particularly cheesed off about that because that's their whole business, isn't it? Charging people to access that.
Over here in the white, please.
Thank you. I'm Lucas. I'm starting at City in September, and with more people, especially young people, turning to online platforms, YouTube, even social media platforms like TikTok to be informed about the world, I think that alongside AI, there's another issue that the tech revolution sort of poses to journalism, and that how sophisticated these algorithms are getting in terms of not only showing you what you want to see, feeding back to you what you want to see, but also, especially with TikTok sort of claiming to even know your quirky side and things like that. I wondered, well, and also next to that, there's the issue that there's this erosion of our attention spans as well. And I imagine it's bad enough trying to get quality reporting into sort of 3-minute, 5-minute slot. Now you've got to deal with trying to get something, in 10 seconds up to a minute. So I sort of wondered how you thought that might affect the media landscape going forward.
Yeah. Well done for sitting through my lecture, by the way. Then you probably, I think it's, yeah. I mean, it's like a whole other thing, that, isn't it? It's like extremely worrying that the kind of your generation, I imagine. Are you 20? 24, but even, probably slightly younger than you then as well, don't come to actual publisher websites, do they? They experience the news through social media, and like you say, there's that whole other level of AI and algorithmic gaming that's going on, which is, I guess, nothing other than a huge challenge for the news industry as well. Probably another reason why the tech platforms need a whole lot more oversight, because of the sort of window they've got into people's souls, haven't they? And especially children as well. So people's developing brains. But we could do a whole nother evening on that, couldn't we? I would think.
Definitely. Over here in the grey, please.
Hello, my name's Luke. Just a quick one. You just said that these companies like OpenAI have been scraping data behind paywalled websites. Have you guys seen evidence of data scraping behind paywalls at Press Gazette?
Well, certainly that's the belief of the newspaper owners. I spoke to a CEO who I won't name this morning, but he said that they sort of interrogated the thing, spent some time interrogating. I think it was ChatGPT, and they said, like, are you reading our paywalled content? And they said, yes, I am. They said, well, why are you doing that? That's our copyright. And I think it said something like, I'm a robot, I can do what I want, or I'm a computer, I can do what I want. And when they raised that with the company, they said, oh, well, the thing tells you what you want to hear, and it hallucinates. So it's like, none of it really inspires a lot of confidence, but they're certainly labouring under that understanding that it has scraped and read their paywalled content.
And over here on the right, please. Just over here, please. Yeah.
My name's Killian. I've just graduated from City, so if anyone's got a job they want to give me, then come find me afterwards. One of my great frustrations with British journalism is the apparent aversion to more kind of creative and literary sort of writing, and features especially, in the way that you might see in American magazines like The New Yorker. So do you think the ability of generative AI to write all other kinds of journalism except that means that that kind of journalism might become more valued in the UK, or is that overly optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I guess maybe the hope is that maybe that generative AI will commodify a lot of the kind of sort of rote reporting, meaning that maybe journalists do have to bring something else to the party. And like you say, maybe a bit more humanity. Although when we talk to write news, we talk to tell it very straight, aren't we? But then I suppose it's the selection of news, isn't it? It's the selection of stories, and it's the human element, which is often the just speaking to people, winning their trust, and all that sort of thing, which kind of is actually the thing which distinguishes, you know, very good reporters from just ordinary ones. So I like to think that, you know, maybe it will encourage better news reporting, which is more original, more human-based, more based on sort of interaction. Yeah, maybe there'll be a better premium on the sort of more nuanced sort of writing that kind of, you know, ChatGPT is never going to really be able to replicate, is it? I don't think. Hope not.
Time for one or two more questions, if anyone has any more. Yeah, one just there, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel, also at News Associates with Graham. If you're saying that trust is a massive problem in UK journalism, and you're advocating for us using tools which we know hallucinate, do you think you need some sort of industry standards about how we use them? I know like the FT and Wired have put out like their guidelines on how they use AI. Do you think you need something like that industry-wide to sort of keep trust?
Yeah, I think that would be...
And what would you want to see in it?
Sorry?
What would you want to see in the guidelines?
Well, I think probably the main thing is just complete sort of transparency around how we're doing things. So I think one of the big problems is the online space has got so confused and messy, hasn't it? So you often don't know what's real and what's not real anymore, especially if you go to Twitter, when, you know, no one's verified anymore, and you know, there's so much sort of fake content and fake adverts on there. Yeah, I think probably it would be really, really helpful for professional journalists to say we are 100% transparent about when we use any automation or any sort of ChatGPT-like tools, and that otherwise, unless we say so, our content is 100% sort of checked, human checked and human sort of verified. And I think that could probably be, you know, a great sort of selling point for proper journalism versus the sort of fakes.
Any more questions?
Dom, you gave us a nice insight into your career path. So imagine you're putting your name into ChatGPT, whatever it's called, and you ask, what happens to my career going forward? So how do you see things panning out for you? What do you want to achieve, and, you know, what's the next act?
Well,
in less than 20 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, whoa. Press Gazette, Press Gazette sort of £1 billion valuation. You know, yeah, beach house in Malibu. Yeah, tend to. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I find journalism is quite hard to make plans, isn't it? Because whatever plans you make, you'll go off in completely the opposite direction. But maybe that's the sort of joy of the joy of it to a certain extent, isn't it? I think. Yeah, I've always thought it's a bit like acting journalism. If you can stay employed, then, you know, if you're working, then it's quite good, isn't it? That's quite a good career. But it's actually Press Gazette has probably turned out better than I expected in terms of, like, you know, what we've achieved commercially, and so on. So, but, you know, I know when I do pass on the mantle, I'll leave it in good hands in Charlotte over there. Charlotte, I'm handing over the baton now. No, not just yet. Not till I've had some wine.
Well, I'm very glad that he's handing over the baton to you and not to a digital replica of himself or indeed any of the rest of us. How incredibly refreshing in these most peaceful of surroundings to hear such fighting talk. And I think it's really inspiring, Dom, to hear you talking about us as journalists having to earn our place. And I think one thing I would say is that when it comes to making sure the truth is told, at least we, in theory, have the skills to do that, to interrogate systems like ChatGPT. I mean, that's what we do, isn't it? We check our sources, we fact check, we use this judgment that we've developed over the years. We don't just accept what we read as gospel. Hopefully, that will serve us well. But what I found, I think, most powerful of all is the message to all of us that we have to stay creative. I mean, however good ChatGPT gets, and we don't know, do we really, whether it's learning or not, that will all become clear. But what we do know is that it doesn't have imagination, it doesn't have insight or foresight, it doesn't know what questions to ask, it can't invent its own original questions yet, it doesn't have empathy. At the moment, it doesn't have shoe leather and the ability to go and find the people who can tell us what they're experiencing, who in the end give us the stories we need to tell. And that, I think, especially hearing about your career and the many years you spent doing that, remains absolutely critical. So I think, Dom, for me, the central message seems to be for all of us, stay combative, negotiate, litigate, but keep creating above all. And hopefully, that will stand us in good stead in a really, really challenging environment. But for now, I would like to invite you all to join us for a drink, courtesy of Kaizo, our sponsors. An enormous thanks to them again. But most of all, can we just thank Dom for his time and for his words tonight. Thanks, Dom.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.